Well, greetings once again, and welcome to Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. And our guest today, Rishika Kartik, is probably able to talk about all three of those things. For people who listen to this regularly, you know we love to make inclusion the number one thing that we list as inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected, because inclusion we consider involves disabilities, whereas diversity does not. But Rishika can talk about both of those as well as the unexpected. There's a lot that she has to offer. Well, if you haven't yet, you should go read her bio in our cover notes. She has done a lot of different stuff. I would say she describes herself as a creative activist and disabilities advocate, and she's going to talk about that among other things. And I'm not going to give it all away because where would the fun be in that? So Rishika, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
She's a TedX speaker too, so there you go. Well, anyway, why don't we start like I love to do? Tell me about the early Rishika, the child person, and how you got started and whatever you all are doing and why you do what you do.
Ooh, thank you for that question.
An open-ended question. Boy, that can take an hour, but go ahead.
Absolutely. Early me, I would say very interested in learning, very curious. I was always pretty outgoing and definitely super socially awkward. I had a regrettable fashion sense and a caffeine intolerance, as I like to joke, and I used to believe that pizza was a food group. So in that sense, I think I've definitely matured from my younger teenage self. But my main interest started really when I was around 14. When I was 14, I found the best learning experiences through informal opportunities, whether that was museums or talking with friends or exploring. But in conventional settings, I found it difficult to express my ideas or feel like I belonged. I was kind of lonely, and so I wanted to make more friends and broaden my perspective. Something that I always grew up admiring and appreciating was hearing my mom tutor people in the dining room. My mom has always had a penchant for teaching, and something was fascinating to me about the ability for someone to make someone believe that they could do something and make someone have more wonder in their life, understanding how things worked. And so when I got to high school, I talked to the director of service learning to recommend some organizations that I could volunteer with. Around that time, I found out that a relative of mine had become blind, and witnessing how my family's perception of her changed over the years made me really interested in blindness advocacy in general, something that I previously had never been exposed to. So I took a leap of faith and I started volunteering at the Colorado Center for the Blind with my dad, and from there I fell in love with it. I always mentioned being interested in creativity, but I realized that my definition of creativity was fairly one-dimensional. I assumed that to be innovative or creative was very visual. And so to be around people that did everything I was doing in a new way, thought differently, and had all different backgrounds and experiences really resonated with me. I joined the Tactile Art Club with a friend, which is art exploring through touch. And from there, I fell in love with advocacy and everything else that I'm doing. So fast forward a little bit about me now, I'm a sophomore at Brown University, and my love for art and design has manifested into making my own major, disability and design.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, my goal is to create inclusive products and systems to unlock new ways of experiencing the world. And a couple of things that I do, I'm the founder of Vision of the Artist's Soul Project. And this is an initiative that partners with organizations like the National Federation of the Blind to increase accessibility in arts and education through design workshops and advocacy events. I also explore accessible design at Brown through a robotics and dance initiative called CIRC. I'm the co-studio lead for Design for America here on campus, which works on social impact design projects. I'm on the board member of Mirror Image Arts, which is a youth advocacy organization that works with incarcerated or underserved youth. And on the side, I appreciate doing research on accessibility and health equity.
Why did you become so curious? You strike me just from listening to you and what you said here, but also talking with you. And I suppose I should explain that a little bit. But why did you become such a curious person?
I think that life is endlessly fascinating, the intricate labyrinths of mysteries that the world has to offer. I think that it's a fundamental human desire to want to learn more about the strange world that we live in. And so I suppose just feeling like everything was new and unfamiliar made me have a desire to understand things and understand people. I think curiosity comes from feeling discomfort, but in a positive way. Having a conversation with someone and wanting to know why their ideas differ from yours, or being in class and feeling cognitive dissonance about a concept that you should be able to understand, but just can't. I think that that feeling of discomfort promotes me to seek new understandings. And there's nothing that makes me more curious than disability advocacy. It's interesting because I feel like communities with disabilities innovate so much, and yet there's so much limited understanding within a broader able-bodied population. So I think bridging that gap is where my curiosity lies.
Your parents, I have not met your mom. I met your dad, and I should explain. That's what I was mentioning earlier about talking more about how we know each other. I met you through, as you know, your dad, who does volunteer at the Colorado Center for the Blind, and I'm the vice president of that board. And he kindly drove me from the airport when we flew in for a board meeting to the Colorado Center and so on, and helped with some other things that weekend. And then, of course, we got to see each other, you and I, and he, at the national convention of the National Federation of the Blind this year. And that's when we talked about you coming on to Unstoppable Mindset. But your father, and I'm assuming from what you said, your mom as well, also strike me as being people who are very curious and people who are very open to exploring things that are different what they understand. And I would assume that that has also been something that helped your curiosity.
Oh, definitely. My parents are one of my biggest role models, I think, because of their outlook on life. My mom has been a lifelong educator. While she started as an electrical engineer, she switched to teaching and then eventually a principal and a head of school. And through that, she always wanted to communicate complex ideas with people and understand what was going on. I think the reason why I like engineering so much is something that drove my mom to pursue engineering in the first place, which is the idea that if you take complex mysteries in the world and simplify them to terms that you understand, you gain the tools to be able to do things you've always wanted to do. And I know that's something that Unstoppable Mindset talks about a lot. I think about the idea of linguistic determinism, which is essentially that you only think in the terms of what you know, and you can't do something that doesn't exist. So the more you learn about what there is, the more you realize what could be, and the more you're able to do things that excite you. Similarly, my dad pursued architecture, which is very novel at a time where he lived in India, it was very uncommon to pursue something other than engineering, medicine, or law. And despite the pushback that he initially faced, I think he's such a creative person because the arts as a field is about being curious about what could happen, even if something goes wrong. And I think growing up with those two influences really informed my view on life.
Well, knowing what your dad does, tell our listeners a little bit about what he does, because that certainly is as creative as it gets.
My dad's job is cool. He designs news sets for broadcast news. So think things like CBS or KRDO, that's him.
Well, I guess we probably won't worry about designing a set for this since mostly people listen and won't see it anyway, but we could create an audio set. That would be fun.
Well, it's been interesting to see the intersections between my parents' expertise and my own. I feel like definitely at the beginning, I had a bit of resistance, to be honest, about pursuing a design adjacent field because of what my mom and dad did, the whole individuality complex and desire to be different. But I realized that having their expertise really helped me pursue my goals. When I was working on an exhibit that was tactily accessible, I really relied on my dad's knowledge of architecture and construction. I did a consulting project with a few healthcare organizations about how to make their public spaces more accessible, and having the architectural background that my dad had really helped me. And on the reverse, my dad has now worked on a set for a game show for people who are deaf. And my dad didn't really have an interest in disability advocacy at all until we started volunteering together. Now that I've graduated from college, I think he's looking for even more community and connection, which is why he's so interested in staying involved with CCB. And I think CCB has really informed his view of his work and also what design can do as well. So I think there's definitely accessible design in his future.
Well, there you go. How do you think his view has changed being involved with the CCB?
Ooh, this is a good question. I mean, I think that his view has changed in similar ways that I have. The first view being, I think we live in a very ocular-centric society, especially when it comes to what we deem as aesthetic or enjoyable. he studied for pretty much his whole life about how to communicate things through vision, not really thinking about the other senses. And yet, when you start to think about incorporating other senses, even the visual parts become better. A classic example from my life is that I have a website for the things that I do. And I started a website to democratize knowledge. That's something that I believe in strongly. And when I got advice from people at the National Federation of the Blind, things like using a high contrast color palette for people with color
Low
blindness,
vision, right?
yeah, hierarchical text, I realized that it was just visually better and more aesthetic. And I see my dad incorporating some of those things too. But I think on a broader philosophical scale, I think both he and I have become more daring, because I think to accept others is also to accept yourself. To realize that there's no right way of doing something rids you of a so-called functional fixedness and allows you to pursue new ideas. And so I think that he is more open to ideas that might deviate from the norm as a result of the philosophy of the Colorado Center for the Blind, which is living the life that you want to live in the way that you want to live it, not in the way that other people think you should.
Right. And for those who don't know, the Colorado Center for the Blind is an organization in Littleton, Colorado, that teaches people who are losing eyesight or who have lost eyesight and never got the appropriate training. They teach them blindness techniques and how to function as a blind person. For sighted kids growing up, you kind of learn it naturally. You get to observe your surroundings. You observe what your parents are doing, and you get taught a lot by observing all that. Well, that's available for blind people if parents and others give them the opportunity to use it. Unfortunately, all too often, blind people get way too sheltered, or when they become blind later in life, they've got to learn the techniques like cane travel, how to cook, how to do any number of other things, how to be aware of your surroundings. And the Colorado Center for the Blind does that, which is really pretty cool. It's a residential program. People will go there and spend months on end. And I don't know, Rishika, have you participated in any of this? At the end of your time at the center, one of the last things that you get to do is to cook a meal for all the students and staff at the center. You plan the menu, you cook the meal, and obviously everyone eats it, and hopefully it tasted good. Have you been involved in any of those?
Oh my gosh, I've had the fortune to be involved in several of those, and this actually brings me to a funny story. One of the ways that I met a friend of mine from the Colorado Center for the Blind was one of the Thanksgiving celebrations. So I consider the Center for the Blind to be sort of a second family to me, and so they invited me over for dinner, and this was close to one of the ends where people were learning to cook independently. And so we got randomly assigned, and I was assigned to help with the turkey. And this was funny for a number of reasons. The first being, I'm a terrible cook. Like, seriously, if there was an opportunity to burn ramen in the microwave, I would be able. I have being humble here, shockingly good talent at ruining food. Not to mention that I was also a vegetarian, and I was put on the turkey, which added some extra dimension. My friend, on the other hand, was a pretty good cook, but she had been with vision most of her life, and so she was still getting used to doing things with other senses. So us together was very chaotic. Our turkey ended up tasting pretty questionable, but on the way, we had so much fun. And I realized that sometimes, even if the end isn't what you think it is, the relationships that you form around the way are really formative, and we kept in touch after that. Plus, I realized that cooking turkey can be really fun.
There you go. But you're not ready to cook a turducken yet, huh?
Yeah, I don't think that turducken is in my future, and I have a vendetta against tofurkey. So maybe I'm leaving it to the mashed potatoes.
Well, nothing wrong with good mashed potatoes either, or sweet potatoes and all that other stuff. So, well, I hope that this year's Thanksgiving dinner, wherever you have it, tastes good. But it is interesting. I've been involved. I've not been involved directly, other than one time I was at a dinner when a student was graduating. And they did a good job of cooking. I do some things well. I've never really specialized and become an expert at doing a lot of things with sauces, but I can make it work if I have to. But I'd love to grill and do other things like that. And I can make a medium rare steak as well as the next guy. So, which my wife and I both liked medium rare, and I know that it's very easy to overcook. So I've learned how to do that sort of stuff pretty well. But, life is fun. It's always an adventure. So, well, tell me, in terms of talking about this whole issue of let's say, blindness, and as you pointed out, a very ocular-oriented world. And I think that is very true. We emphasize eyesight. I was actually reading something in the World Health Organization article about how vision is the most important sense that we have. And I can make a strong case for why it's not, although it is the most emphasized and most common sense as we view it, although, again, it ought not to be, because I can hear a whole lot more around me than you can see without turning your head. But leaving that aside, why is it, if you will, why should sighted people be more interested in addressing some of these issues of access and inclusion?
I think the first thing, in terms of a sighted perspective, is that it opens your new doors, both to new opportunities and new people. When you discover new modes of learning and connecting, as the scholar Haben Girma once said, you end up creating the next best thing. Inventions like the typewriter, the potato peeler, things like that, were created as access technology, and yet we use them every day. I had a fascinating case of one person who now works at NASA, and he took his expertise from accessible design. People think that that has nothing to do with one another, but this person had spent their life making kitchens accessible to people with mobility problems or impairments. And when you design for that diverse population, translating that into outer space where people also have limited mobility gives you a new perspective. You always are able to apply the things you're designing for in new ways. In my life, it's allowed me to connect with people better. I realized that I'm an auditory learner, which is something I would have never figured out had I not worked with the National Federation of the Blind. These days, rather than reading essays, I listen to podcasts. I realized that that's how my brain works. Not saying that everyone is non-visual, but certainly I think we have a lot more diversity in our brains than our culture gives us credit for. And only when you understand what's possible by interacting with diverse people and prioritizing accessibility first can you unlock some of those opportunities. The second thing I think about is connections and meeting new people. There's that quote that the goal of the human enterprise is to cure the disease of loneliness. And I think that's really true. The number one factor for happiness is relationships. And in an inaccessible world, you automatically limit the amount of perspectives that you're able to learn from, the meaningful relationships you're able to form with others. I even think about this in terms of the fire alarm analogy. You never know when you might have a visual impairment, when you might identify as a person with a disability. Disability is one of the most common forms of, I guess, being minoritized in the United States, and yet it's something that a lot of people don't really think about. Everyone has rights to live a full life, and just like every building is built with a fire alarm, I think every building should be built with accessibility. Not because everyone needs the accessibility accommodation, but one, it creates better, safer, more robust buildings, and two, when it is needed, it's important, and that allows everyone to participate as they deserve. And finally, I think about economically or just socially. One of the things that we talk a lot about is artificial intelligence and the way that the future is going. And I think with the future, the most important thing is going to be the ability to innovate. When you are able to think about things differently, whether trying to access information that was traditionally visual through touch, or trying to understand how you'd be able to do something with one limb with another, you end up creating better ideas, having more consumers, and having more impact.
You know, it's interesting listening to you, and you said a couple of things I think are relevant to comment on, and I've done it a number of times on this podcast, so not picking on you, but we need to get away from using some of the terminology that we use, like visual impairment and mobility impairment. And the reason I say that is impaired, first of all, who's impaired compared to what? When we talk about visual impairment, it's a double whammy negative because, first of all, visually, we're not different simply because we don't see. But yet the professionals and all the so-called experts for years have called us visually impaired, and they still do to a fairly large degree. We got to get away from that. But also impaired, that means that you are comparing me automatically to someone who has full eyesight. Well, there are a whole lot of people who don't have full eyesight, although you can correct it with glasses and so on, but are they impaired? And so we've got to get away from using some of those terminologies. So I urge people to use terms like blind and low vision, because I'm not really doing the same comparisons and I'm not using the negative terms that I think have contributed to our view of people who are blind or low vision, because oh my God, I don't want to be impaired. And I know it can happen to me. I'll be impaired, and we don't want that. So we really have to deal with terminology somehow, in part, to address those issues. If you talk to a person who is deaf and you call them hearing impaired, you're liable to be in serious trouble, because they've learned that hard of hearing is a whole lot more relevant and appropriate term than impaired, because we're not making the same comparison. You're not saying I'm impaired if I happen to be deaf or hard of hearing, as opposed to someone who has no hearing issue at all. So we've got to get out of these habits of using some of these terms so that people become a little bit more understanding that it's not about impairment. It's not about visual. And so it's, I think, one of the things that we need to really get society to understand. And it goes back to what you were talking about before. It's all about education. It's all about understanding. But we tend to fall into those same traps. And it's something that we do need to, in one way or another, address, don't you think?
I absolutely agree. And thank you for bringing that point up. I'm still young and I'm still definitely learning, but I see how this language manifests in my everyday life, even with phrases like blindsided or turning a blind eye, blindness as a metaphor for ignorance, which I think has been the opposite of my personal experience. And language dictates how we frame things and how we think about things. It's the same reason why I think I'm interested in design, because when you interact with something, it isn't just about the object itself, but what the object conveys. An example being, if there is a really hard to use ramp, even though it's functionally accessible, it sends a message that someone needs to have a separate entrance as opposed to being able to go with their friends or being able to go with everyone else. And so I think that the first step to changing people's behaviors is changing the way that we talk about things.
Yeah. Well, and my wife used to watch the Property Brothers all the time, and we saw so many times they would design homes or other things on HGTV. They would design homes, they would go modify homes. And the only time there would ever be a discussion about access is if they happened to be dealing with someone who used a wheelchair or had some other issue that required specifically changes and modifications to the home to make it usable, rather than saying, we really ought to be putting ramps in. We really ought to be creating access right out of the gate so that we recognize that everyone is included.
Absolutely. I even loved your framework of thinking about comparisons, like impaired compared to what. I think that goes to show what our society values and perhaps incorrectly values. I learned yesterday that the word normal was originally just a mathematical term to describe the middle of a bell curve, in no way better or less than the poles or anything else, really. But when we started to use normal as ideal and therefore good, I think that we missed out on a lot of opportunities because we compare what unique assets people bring to the so-called standardized model. And that goes against everything we know about biodiversity and the way that successful societies thrive. It's about the survival of the most adaptable, the way that people work together by bringing in unique perspectives and being able to collaborate. That's what creates strong communities.
You mentioned the typewriter. Do you know the story of the typewriter?
Yes, wasn't it built by a blind inventor to send love letters?
Well, it was invented. I don't know that it was the inventor was blind, but it was invented for a countess who was blind, who wanted to send love letters to someone other than her husband without her husband seeing them. So she wanted to be able to create the letters rather than having someone else write them and they fall into the wrong hands. So the typewriter was invented to do that. But another part about it is this whole term of disability, and people, a lot of diversity experts say to me, well, but disability starts with dis. It's not. I don't know the origin of the word discrete or any other number of things that start with DIS that are not necessarily a not kind of term. But the reality is we're good at changing words whenever we want to. I mean, look at diversity. It does not include disabilities by definition of the way people define it. They talk about race, gender, sexual orientation, so on, but don't talk about disabilities. But what people don't recognize is every single person on this planet has a disability. And for those of you who can see, and again, we've talked about it here, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. I'll let you react to it. The reality is that disability is something that we all have. For you people who can see, your disability is covered up because in 1878, Thomas Edison invented the electric light bulb as a way and as a reasonable accommodation for light-dependent people to be able to see in the dark. But get rid of the light, and you guys are in a world of hurt. Can you learn to get around in the dark? You can. We do it all the time. But the problem is that people don't recognize that light dependence is as much a disability in its own way as light independence that some of us have. And the fact of the matter is all the light bulb and everything that has happened since to create on-demand lighting has simply been a way to cover up your disability. It doesn't mean that it still isn't there. Just be somewhere where suddenly the power goes out and you can't find your smartphone or a flashlight right away. Then what are you going to do? It is still there. It is still a much a disability. So rather than regarding disability as a negative thing, we should regard it as a characteristic that all of us manifest in different ways.
I definitely agree. I even think about that in terms of depending on who has the power, how a situation gets characterized. I think about a friend of mine who had a bit of trouble communicating orally, but was a really talented writer. And that's a skill that I wish I had, the ability to put complex thoughts through language. And yet when I was working with a organization with primarily Spanish speakers and my language communication wasn't that good, one could argue using the framework that I too didn't have the ability to communicate, yet I felt much less chastised than she did in a society that prioritizes English communication. So I think that's like another example of how everything is relative depending on exactly what you're saying, characteristics rather than value judgments.
Yeah, exactly as it should be. What are the most important lessons that you think that you've learned since you became involved with the blind and low vision community?
Ooh, I really like this question. I think I'm constantly learning new lessons. I think the first thing is just to ask excellent questions instead of maintaining assumptions. I really struggled at the beginning, especially because my heart was in a good place, but I'm aware that as someone who has vision, I don't want to come off as someone who's taking someone else's space. So afraid of saying something wrong or making a mistake, I used to not say anything. And I realized that that's the worst way to approach learning. That breeds the sort of, I guess, passive mentality that doesn't create lasting change. I now realize that when in doubt, just ask. It's much better to be wrong with good intentions and try and improve than stay in a fixed state, and to speak out by listening to others rather than, trying to figure everything out by yourself, asking for help and relying on people around you. The second thing I learned is this idea of anti-fragility. I think in society, we view a lot of things as fixed that aren't. For example, that there's one idea of good art or one idea of a good student, et cetera, et cetera. And we talk a lot about returning to normality. This is a framework that I see a lot of well-intentioned people use when they describe disability, the idea that someone needs to return back to the state that they used to be in. And I think that's completely false because as humans, we're always adapting to our environment. We're always changing. And so I learned that everything is life experience. And anti-fragility is the concept that when something in life happens, you adapt, you change, and you become a better person for it. I think that's a value that I've seen a lot of people at the Center for the Blind have, and something that therefore I have. When there's a challenging situation, I don't necessarily think about how it impairs the way I used to do things or how it challenges me, but rather how I can use this situation to my advantage to become a better person.
And you do that. I think questioning is always a good thing. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. I know some people feel, I don't want to be a teacher. I don't want to be answering questions all the time. But the reality is that we all should ask questions. And if we get offended because somebody asks us a question, then who are we really hurting rather than just dealing with the issue?
Totally. I think there is something to be said about how you ask the question. I think it's unfair to assume that the burden always lies on the members of the community to educate everyone outside of the community. But by the same token, I think that even if you ask questions and someone doesn't want to talk about it right now, at least you're showing that you want to learn, which is much better than you making assumptions about what people want. Yeah.
And it's the reality is that even if you're the person who's being asked, there's a lot to be learned. You may be asked a question that you've never experienced before, or that suddenly you're made to think about something in a different way. I know for me, having been involved so much with the media since September 11th, I've been asked some very creative questions that made me think differently about one thing or another. And certainly they made me just think in general to be able to give intelligent answers to the questions. And there shouldn't be anything wrong with that.
I completely agree with that.
So what have you learned from teaching and writing and blogging and public speaking and so on? What kind of lessons have you learned from all of that?
Well, the first lesson goes back to what you were talking about earlier, which is that storytelling matters. I think that the language we use to talk about stuff is the way that we choose to think about things. I mean, to write is in a way to think and to crystallize your thinking into something tangible. And so similarly, what I've learned from the National Federation of the Blind is to be conscious about what narratives I'm telling, how I'm telling it, whether it's through art, public speaking, and so on. And when I make a mistake, being open to that and changing it. And also consuming and, I guess, absorbing media discerningly. Something that I learned about in my disability studies class is the idea of inspiration porn, which is the idea that well-intentioned outlets and so on use disability as a way to inspire people, which is a great thing. But rather than inspiring people based on someone's resilience, you inspire people from a sense of, oh, thank gosh, that's not me. I should be fortunate for what I have. And that's a very problematic narrative. And so I realized that trying to understand what is being told and how is really important. I learned that teaching is the best learning tool. I recently gave a talk at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus about helping blind patients in doctors' offices. A lot of the physicians over the summer wanted to get a more inclusive design perspective. And in that process, I was learning so much about the information. Mm-hmm. So I think to teach is to learn. And I think the final thing that I learned from teaching is to go with the grain of the student. Something that I mentioned in my TED Talk is that I think the Federation of the Blind succeeds so well in what they do because they don't fit students to a mold, but they fit the mold to the student. They go with what the student is and try and highlight their unique gifts to help them succeed in the way that they want to. And I think about that in my own life too. There was a situation I had tutoring a student where we always wanted him to do math one way. And then we realized that the way that he connects through math and to orientation and mobility is by playing video games. So rather than thinking of that as a distraction, we allowed him to practice with that medium and he flourished. Thinking about those out-of-the-box ideas that harness what people are already doing and what people are already good at, I think has helped me become a better person.
Yeah, we all, and you pointed it out earlier, don't learn the same. And there are a lot of things that we don't do the same. And it doesn't matter about eyesight or not eyesight. We just do things differently for a variety of different kinds of reasons. And there's nothing wrong with that. So I hear exactly what you're saying. I know for me, I learn by listening, but I also learn by hands-on. So I like to touch things. And sometimes people object to that, especially in the art world. I was at MoMA in New York once, and my wife and I were standing in front of this statue, and I reached up, it was on a big pedestal, and I could barely reach the toes of this statue. And I touched a toe, and this guard shot over, "You can't touch that. You can't do that." I said, how am I going to know anything about the art? He didn't care. And the reality is there are not that many blind people who need to touch the art. And all I could touch was a toe. So my gosh, what is that really going to do? But still, the view was you can't touch. And we don't tend to a lot of times recognize the need for art inclusiveness like that.
Absolutely. Don't touch the art is something that I'm very passionate about. It's the reason why the Museum Accessibility Committee at the National Federation of the Blind was started. Also the reason why I'm so interested in accessibility in general, because I think about looking at art and what feelings and knowledge it gives me, and then how much more rich my experience would be if I was able to touch it, even as a sighted person, what details I would notice, how my perspective about the painting or the sculpture would change. And I think that's an opportunity that more people should be able to have.
Yeah. And there's a lot to be experienced from different kinds of art. I have been to other exhibits where people could touch the art, which was great. And of course, there's more than just physical sculptures and so on to art. There's a lot to be said for art from an audio standpoint, whether it's old programs or even just getting audio descriptions of art pieces. But still, for me, touching means a whole lot, and it's important to be able to have that opportunity as well, or to experience it directly is probably the better way to put it.
Absolutely. My favorite initiatives lately was a dance company that was trying to be more inclusive, and they had an initiative called Alt Text as Poetry, where basically all the audience members could describe not only what they saw, but also what they were feeling as they looked at the piece. And then they compiled a new soundtrack that had music, immersive sound, and poetry. And I loved it. I thought it complemented the dance so well, and it made me realize the power of trying to include access from the beginning.
Mm. I'd love to hear that. Sounds like it'd be fascinating to hear.
Absolutely.
Tell me more about tactile design, and you clearly have gotten very interested in it and how that's kind of evolving.
For sure. So, for people that are unfamiliar, the way that I define tactile design is basically a way to experience and convey the world through multiple senses, whether that's sound or touch, etc. And I'm interested in design in particular because everything that you interact with has been designed. Design permeates everyday life. And we experience tactile design all the time. From something as simple as haptic feedback on your phone, hearing a buzz, let's say when you play a mobile game and that giving you an extra rush of dopamine, or something like voice to text or Siri, which is a way to interact with your phone more conveniently by using multiple senses. The first way that I got introduced to tactile design was actually with a mentor of mine. I'm not sure if you know her. She's very well known in this community, Anne Cunningham. She used to teach the Tactile Art Club at the Colorado Center for the Blind, and I saw one of her inventions, which is a sensational blackboard. It was striking because it was just this small piece of rubber, and yet what it did was it enabled people using things that they already had, a pencil and a pen, and some paper, to be able to create raised line drawings and collages. And I loved that. I loved the idea of using design in order to create something that hasn't been created before. As I started volunteering more with the Center for the Blind, I kept seeing these innovative designs, and it helped me change things that I was thinking about. For instance, one of my favorite projects that we did was we had a little pizza to teach kids fractions, and I thought that was such a unique and fun way to include all the senses in order to teach people, all the way to the Shared Visions exhibit. This is an art exhibit that uses multiple senses that happens every year with the Center for the Blind and the Arapahoe Community College. And people that do multisensory exhibits like Dr. Abigail Stengel, Dr. Cheryl Fogel-Hatch, Matt Giswaldi, they all pique your curiosity in new ways. I also think about design as rhetoric, design as communicating ideas. I've seen accessible fashion design that has made me feel more confident, that kind of redefines our idea of what's beautiful and what's valuable. I've seen an app that teaches kids cane travel with music, and it just inspires me to take everyday life and I guess imbue it with a larger sense of wonder and inclusion.
Wow. You have designed, I believe, your own major at Brown. Is that right?
Yes, I have.
Tell me about that, if you would. That sounds pretty intriguing. And the fact that they let you do it, which says something.
I think that definitely says something about Brown prioritizing inclusion and also having faith in its students. That's something I'll never take for granted. But so my major is disability and design, and my major is about contextualizing the technical knowledge of design with the aesthetic knowledge of art, and then imbuing it with sociocultural, medical, and political perspectives to understand how to make designs for communities with disability specifically that are intuitive, inclusive, relevant, and socially responsible. The reason why I created this major was because I believe that there's a lot of disability dongles out in the world, well-intentioned, sighted engineers making things that people don't actually want. And an example that I think about is ballet tutus. I learned recently that ballerinas used to be in a lot of danger because their bodices were made of tulle, or like the costumes that they used to wear, and they would perform near fire. And so this designer made this helpful thing to help them not catch on fire. And yet it never spread. Why? Because it wasn't cute. And that was something that resonated with me. Functionality without appeal, without understanding what people are valuing, how they behave, and how it will be incorporated into society has no meaning. It has no use. And so with my major, what I intend to do is sort of blend the fields of art and engineering to create new things, but also to think about how to restructure social systems of distribution of products or creation of systems in the first place. how we go about thinking about accessibility in the first place, design thinking. I think my major distinguishes itself as a separate field by understanding how people use products and how these products influence environments, communities, and behaviors.
Wow. Tell me more about this whole issue of the design of tutus. I had never heard that before.
Yeah, so I'm really fortunate to currently be working part-time at this institute at Brown called CIRCE, the Conference for Research on Choreographic Interfaces. And a lot of what this institute does overlaps with what we talk about with accessible design. In CIRCE, we talk about how to center human bodies and human intuitive movement to create designs that are not only workable, but also appealing to use and ethical and responsible. And so we look at dance history as a way of thinking about how technologies have historically harmed bodies in the case of, expensive lighting and things like that harming dancers, performers, specifically minoritized communities, including women, often being at risk at technologies that influence our bodies, all the way to surveillance technology, where for the sake of function, people aren't really considering the secondhand consequences that has for our bodily autonomy. And another example that you might find interesting is the Nest smoke alarm. So this is something that I learned about. There was a smoke alarm that came out in, I believe, the early 2000s that wanted to turn off by waving your hands, which sounds like a great idea. I mean, usually smoke alarms are annoying, they're really loud, they suck to turn off. But what they didn't realize is that people sometimes wave their hands, when they catch on fire. And so this ended up being super dangerous. People were trying to turn off their alarms, and the alarm wouldn't turn off just when it was most critical. And that's an example of how we need more design thinking. We need to understand how humans move, how they behave, how movement creates meaning, and also the cultural background between things before we create decisions that could potentially injure people for life.
I gather that somebody figured out that that was not the best design for the Nest alarm.
Yes, I believe now it's been discontinued.
I would hope so. I can appreciate how waving your hand might be an issue. It makes a lot of sense, and it should. I would think waving your hand ought to cause people to take or cause the system to even take more notice. But at least it shouldn't turn off. That would certainly be a big problem. So I'm with you.
Totally. I mean, I think about the implication of expanding technology with accessibility all the time. Another thing that I learned recently was that John Underkoffler, who's the engineer that made all of the things that Tom Cruise used in the famous movie Minority Report, used American Sign Language in order to learn about how computers would turn gestures into meaning. And this makes sense because so far, American Sign Language is the first way that humans have been able to communicate using their body and then transmit complex meaning. And so I think about the implications of access in a world that is becoming more driven by augmented reality, virtual reality, all of these things. In my opinion, it's a great opportunity to stop this sort of ocular centricism and think about when we use our bodies more, or when we use multiple senses, multiple ways of engaging with the world, how we could create more creative technology.
If I recall, we have used American Sign Language or some form of signing even both to communicate with young children like us in a year and a half old who aren't yet able really to speak well as communicating with chimpanzees and other primates.
Wow. I mean, I never knew about that, but that makes a lot of sense. I feel like kids definitely communicate with their faces and expressions and explore the world through touch before they explore them through, verbal cues that adults can understand. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
It's something that I heard in passing somewhere, but I've heard it a few times, especially about children, that children learn or can learn to be pretty expressive by signing. And it's not just pointing to something and say, I want a Big Mac, but can actually learn to communicate, which makes a lot of sense because it isn't that children aren't thinking as soon as they're born, but being able to express it and having the development to do that is a little bit different story.
Absolutely.
So you have taught at Brown. Tell me about your teaching experience.
Yes, that was one of the most rewarding things. I've always loved teaching, in part because I was fascinated by learning. People that inspired me most are my teachers and my professors. I've had the most amazing professors at Brown that have changed the way that I view the world, and also teachers in high school that made me believe that I was capable of doing things in my life. And so when I transitioned to Brown, I was curious as to what it would be like to go from a sort of absorber of knowledge to a producer of one. I collaborated with two students at Brown University, Anna Ort, who's currently in her last semester studying computer science, who identifies as a blind person, and also Daniel Solomon, who's also blind, and he's a freshman at Brown. And we created a public health class called Blindness, Arts, and Media, or as we affectionately like to call it, BAM. And the
Bam.
goal
I was just figuring that out.
Yes. The goal of this class was to bridge the medical and social models of disability. The medical model of disability is talked a lot about at Brown, how to, say, mitigate risk, how to fix problems, the focus on impairment, which we discussed earlier as being problematic, versus the social model thinks about disability as cultural identity. In this class, we wanted to highlight parts of blindness that are often not recognized, especially in a public health course, like how blind communities collaborate together to create music or art, or how education works. I think this is important because when we understand our culture, we understand the study of people. It allows people to better connect with people who are blind in their workforce, in their everyday lives, and also understand how the past informs the present.
There you go. And, you never learn so much as you do when you actually become a teacher.
Absolutely.
There's so much to learn. One of my favorite books is a science fiction book called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein. And without going into a lot of detail, one of the major characters is Professor Bernardo de la Paz III. No, just Professor Bernardo de la Paz. And he would teach anyone anything. And what he said to one of the other characters in the books was, all I need to do is to stay at least one lesson ahead of my student so that I can teach. And of course, part of the art is really learning how to be a teacher. But he's right that all you need to do is to stay ahead a little bit of the student. But also there's truth to be said about learning along with the student, which is also important. And I think a lot of times teachers can learn as much by learning with students. The idea is that they bring experiences that the students don't have yet. So that ought to help the process. But it is as important for a teacher to learn as it is for students to learn.
I completely agree. And I think we often minimize how much we learn from those around us, how much we learn when we're outside of the classroom. That's one of the biggest things that I learned in teaching blindness, arts, and media. Things that we did that increased student engagement wasn't having more complex readings or, less assignments. It was having pizza and having group dinners. What that did was it established a community of trust, a safe space for people to ask questions, a safe space for people to learn from one another. And that also made me reframe relationships in my life differently, thinking about relationships not as tangential to my learning, but very much associated with it. When I meet someone and I approach this interaction with, what can you learn from me and what can I learn from you? I think that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Now, what year again are you in at Brown?
I just finished my first year, so now I'm a second year.
So you're a sophomore.
Yes.
At Brown. So you haven't got to graduate school or any of that yet.
No.
It's coming. It's coming.
In the future.
Well, there you go. Well, that is a pretty cool thing. But, already you've given a TEDx talk. Tell me about that.
TEDx talk was such a great experience. I mean, talk about learning from other people. I truly feel like the unexpected benefits of it was the community. One, to be able to meet the other speakers. It's very rare to be in a room of people who are extremely good at what they do, and what they do differs so much from your own. I remember learning from a professor who specialized in mindfulness to a master's student who was really passionate about nuclear engineering, and more people such as that. So the collaboration was really great. And also the collaboration that I've felt online. I think that another thing that excites me about digital technology is the opportunity to connect with others you might not have otherwise and start a dialogue. One of the fun facts of my TED Talk was that a security guard at an art museum actually reached out to me afterwards and said, "I've been telling people not to touch the art for 25 years, and you made me change my mind." And I thought conversations like that was really powerful.
Wow.
And I did the talk. But for people that want to learn more, it's a talk about how working with the blind community and blind artists specifically have helped me to see the world differently, and also how prioritizing accessibility can make you more creative, coming from a disability gain perspective.
And in our cover notes, we do include a link to your TEDx talk. So that's cool. So how do you create a growth mindset in your life?
Creating a growth mindset is definitely easier said than done. But I think one thing is that when you reframe achievement or success, it helps me. I think about things in terms of verbs and not nouns. Nouns feel very stagnant to me versus verbs seem attainable. Another way of saying that is setting systems, not goals. For example, a noun could be that I'm a really good student. That's something that's hard to maintain. Everyone fails sometimes, everyone has a bad day. But if you have a verb, I am attentive in class, or I try my best every day. That's something that's a lot more attainable. And I think that when we focus on the systems of improvement every day and also focus on what you can do over time, it helps. There's a saying that I forget where it comes from, that we so much overestimate what we can do in one day and so much underestimate what we can do in 1 year. And I think putting that into perspective and allowing yourself to have setbacks as long as your overall trajectory is positive is something that really helped me. The other thing is to have a support network to fail, to invest in relationships, and to make the process more enjoyable. I think that there is something to be said about optimizing efficiency, but at the same time, life is ultimately meant to be experienced and to live. And so I think that having little joys and being conscious of being grateful for them, whether that's putting on nice music when you do laundry or something as silly as that, to having a friend that can go with you through tough times, I think that's the thing that gives me the most resilience. And I think the final thing I'll say on that is, I believe Dr. Demore said that the situation is either unfamiliar, uncomfortable, or unachievable. And understanding those two are very different. Oftentimes we say something's unachievable when it's just unfamiliar. And allowing yourself to be uncomfortable, I think, is a skill like anything else, like math, like painting, like creativity. When I joined Mirror Image Arts, for example, I felt very unfamiliar. It's an organization that works with at-risk or underserved incarcerated youth, and it's a theater organization. I literally couldn't do theater to save my life, and I'd never worked with that population before, and yet it's been one of the most formative experiences in my life. Putting yourself intentionally through those scenarios helps you develop a growth mindset by default.
How would you encourage people to learn more about how to be resilient themselves? Because you're a very resilient kind of person. Maybe you might want to define that as well, but how would you encourage people to learn that?
A thought-provoking question. I mean, I think you give me a lot of credit, but you emulate the people that you're surrounded by. So I think the first thing is to look at resilient people in your life and analyze their patterns. What are they day-to-day practices? How can you sort of be inspired by them and do things that they do? I think I'm only resilient because of members of the NFB. I'm only resilient because of my family, of my friends, teachers, and mentors. I also think that exposure is really important, because when you learn about what has been done and the possibilities of the world, you're able to then pivot when things go wrong. You're able to understand that there's more than one outcome of life, and you're able to have the knowledge to deal with uncertainty. The way that I sort of do that is by reading a lot, listening to podcasts, listening to music, maybe traveling, whatever's accessible to you. But I think the more, ideas we have, the more we're able to bounce back when our idea of what's correct goes wrong.
I would submit, though, there is more to it than just experiencing. It's also thinking about it and analyzing it. And I'm wondering if every day you take time to analyze what has happened, what happens, what's going on, and study all of that internally to draw conclusions about where to go and how to proceed.
Yes, this is actually something that I think my mindset has changed a lot. I mean, I started in high school pretty different than I am now, actually. I had an interest in art, but I always just assumed that I would be a straight shot sort of engineering kid. I liked math, I was decently good at it, and I didn't really see the need for things like, writing about my feelings. I thought that it would detract from my schoolwork or silly things like that. But now I realize that learning only comes when you think about things, when you reflect about what happens in your life. Everything is a learning experience, but it's only a learning experience if you're able to articulate, understand, or at least process what you learn. And so for me, it's really funny because I have a couple of best friends. Like I said, I'm an audio person. So journaling hasn't really worked for me in the past, but I send them really long voice messages about what I learned that day. And then I find that when I communicate my ideas to them, I learn something new about myself. And when they do that to me, I learn something about them too.
And even sometimes when you hear them, you learn something about yourself.
Totally.
So that works, which I understand. So what are you working on now? You're in your second year at Brown. So what's happening? What's the plan?
The first plan is to get some soft serve ice cream at my dining hall. No, I'm just kidding.
What flavor?
I like the vanilla chocolate swirl. I think that's the best. Vanilla chocolate swirl in a cake cone. You can't go wrong. And
is there a soft serve machine at the dining hall?
Yes, there is.
Oh,
sometimes
good.
I get creative with it as well, adding some Oreos for some trail delight.
For sprinkles.
But yeah, so the current projects, currently for CRC, the Conference for Research on Choreographic Interfaces, I'm working on a podcast project called Dances with Robots. So if what I said about the Nest smoke alarm or, ballerinas catching on fire was interesting to you or any of the listeners, I highly recommend that. That's going to be coming out soon.
And what's it called again?
It's called Dances with Robots.
Dances with Robots. Okay.
Yes. The other thing that I'm working on is that I have the opportunity this semester to be part of the Aspect Patient Engagement Program at the Center for Vision and Population Health. And basically, this is a group that centers around storytelling, highlighting positive narratives of blindness, and also working with patients about, what they're thinking about with vision loss and connecting them to communities, resources, and support. And so with that, I'm trying to work on a directory project with Dr. Penny Rosenblum, who's been a long-term researcher and mentor and just, I guess, inspiration of mine, to create a way for people to connect with other people with similar experiences and goals and build that community. Another thing that we're working on is a panel about eye health and awareness, featuring people with vision loss, practitioners, clinicians, and allies who want to learn more. The other thing I'm doing is that I'm co-studio lead for Design for America, which is really fun. This is the way that I make friends on campus. So we're starting our recruiting, and I'm excited to think about the socially minded projects that we're doing this year. And then the other thing that I'm looking forward to doing is getting more involved with research and an interest in medicine. This semester, I'm hoping to work on curriculum development like I did last semester teaching a class, and to bring a more, disability justice and design perspective to hospitals, to medical places, and also to work on a research project that involves accessibility and raise awareness about it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of important work that could be done there in terms of hospitals. I'm not convinced that hospitals necessarily always get the training they should to deal with persons who have what we consider disabilities and so on. I know my wife had challenges a couple times in hospitals, and observing what was going on. I think people thought they knew what they were supposed to do, or they knew what they were doing, and they didn't. And what they did was contradictory to what really needed to be done to give the best care. In the ophthalmological world, of course, and I'm sure you've heard about this sort of thing, the ophthalmological world knows little about blindness and certainly doesn't have a very strong and really good positive attitude about it.
I love that you mentioned that, because that's one of the key reasons that I'm considering ophthalmology as a potential profession, among others. I think that it's so true that we unnecessarily split medical parts of someone's life with the social parts, when everyone knows that one necessarily influences the other to make a whole person.
Mm-hmm.
I think about that in terms of medical school itself. The reason why eye doctors also know about, say, the GI system is that for a lot of people, their eye disease is as a result of diabetes, diabetic retinopathy. And yet this intersection is viewed so much in the physical body and not so much at all in terms of social life. When someone's saying that they're having a hard time in school, yes, the doctor should be thinking about how to optimize their vision, but also have some resources as to how to find a TVI or how to find something like the Colorado Center for the Blind. And that intersection, I think, is heavily missing, and a bridge that I'd like to fix.
Well, and I think even more important, they shouldn't view it as a failure if they can't save a person's eyesight. It starts mentally with that, because that's typically what happens. And we really need to get people to understand it isn't necessarily a failure. Yeah, you'd love to scientifically be able to make everyone be able to see, because we really would like everyone to have all of their senses. But the reality is, in a lot of ways, people don't necessarily have all their senses. We won't go to politicians, but the fact is that we all, yeah, you got it. We all have challenges, strengths, and weaknesses, and no one should be condemned for having a different set of skills or gifts than others of us. And unfortunately, all too often, ophthalmologists, when they discover a person's losing their eyesight, just say, "Oh, there's nothing I can do. I can't save your eyesight," and they just walk out of the room.
I completely agree. And I think about that in terms of narratives, which we were talking about earlier too. When I had visited the doctor as a kid, that was someone that I trusted the most. I think physicians are special in that they interact with people at their most vulnerable, and physicians are very trusted. And so if a physician makes recommendations to someone without knowledge of the blind community, the person is going to internalize and listen to that message. If a physician says there's nothing to do, even if there is resources and a world of possibility, the person is going to internalize that now they are somehow less than. And I think that's just unfortunate and so sad. Something that I would also like to work on is bringing back the blind perspective. In my opinion, I think every ophthalmologist should, attend a meeting from the NFP, volunteer. I know ophthalmologists are super busy and already stretched really thin, but I think the accessibility needs that people are bringing up aren't things that take a lot of time or effort. They're things that either reframe your way of thinking, which then makes you a better physician all around, or there are things that are fairly easy to implement, but it starts with understanding what the community wants, not based on your hypothesis as a sighted person, but by interacting with that community.
If there's one thing you'd like people to take away from our discussion today, what would it be?
Ooh. I think the idea that accessibility is a form of creativity, that just really resonates with me. The idea that disability is a new way of experiencing the world, and even people like me who are sighted tremendously benefit by getting involved with disability advocacy. If I've moved even one person to try and prioritize accessibility in their school, workplace, or community, I'm happy.
Well, if people want to learn more about you and maybe discover Dances with Robots when it comes out and so on, how do they do that?
Yes, my website is rishikakartik.com.
Can you spell that, please?
Yeah, Rishika studio studio.com. And they're also welcome to look me up on Instagram and LinkedIn. My Instagram is at Rishika K Studio, and my LinkedIn is just my name, Rishika space Kartik.
There you go. Well, Rishika, this has been absolutely fun. I really appreciate your time and your insights, and I hope that you listening do as well. Reach out to Rishika. She's got lots to offer, obviously. I'm really looking forward to seeing the adventures as you move forward and the things that you get to do, and I hope that we get to do more of this, and we can certainly do another podcast down the line by all means, and continue to delve into all the things that you've talked about here. But I really appreciate you taking the time to come on with us today. And for all of you, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and Rishika would as well. So email her and email me. I'd appreciate it. Want to know what you think? You can reach me at Michael, MICHAELHI, at accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com, or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhinkson.com/podcast. And wherever you're listening, please give us a 5-star review. We value that very highly, and we value your thoughts and your comments. So please do not hesitate to let us know what you think, and we hope that you liked it. And if there is anything that we can do to improve or enhance, let us know. And for all of you, and Rishika, including you, if you know of anyone else who ought to be a guest on Unstoppable Mindset, please let us know and provide introductions. We would value that greatly. So once more, again, Rishika, thank you for being with us on Unstoppable Mindset. And we look forward to hearing how things go in the future. And thank you for your time and adventures.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate this opportunity. I feel like I learned so much and also had a really fun time sharing what I'm thinking about.
Perfect. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.